Why does a Gucci belt that costs $30 to make sell for $600? Why do people buy $10,000 handbags when a $50 bag does the same job? Why does a Ferrari owner care more about being seen in a Ferrari than actually driving it? In 1899, a strange, antisocial Norwegian-American economist published a book that answered all these questions. He didn't just describe wealthy people's spending habits. He destroyed them. He exposed the entire charade. His name was Thorstein Veblen, and he invented the term that explains half of modern consumer behavior: conspicuous consumption. But here's what makes Veblen's story fascinating. He wasn't just critiquing rich people. He was predicting exactly how modern capitalism would work: the Instagram influencer economy, the luxury brand obsession, the debt-fueled lifestyle flexing. He saw it all coming. In 1899, before cars, before credit cards, before social media. This is the story of the Economist, who exposed why we buy what we buy and why his ideas are more relevant today than ever. Before we get to Veblen's revolutionary ideas, you need to understand what a strange person he was, because Thorstein Veblen might be the most unconventional economist who ever lived. Veblen was born in 1857 in Wisconsin to Norwegian immigrant farmers. He grew up speaking Norwegian and didn't learn English fluently until he was a teenager. This outsider status, never quite fitting into American society, would shape everything he wrote. He was brilliant. He entered Carleton College at 17, earned a PhD from Yale in philosophy. But here's where it gets weird. Despite his intelligence, Veblen couldn't hold a job. He taught at the University of Chicago, then Stanford, then the University of Missouri. He got fired from all of them. Why? He was a terrible teacher. He mumbled. He gave almost everyone C's regardless of their performance. Students fell asleep in his classes. One observer said Veblen lectured to the floor. He had multiple affairs with students and faculty wives, which caused scandals at every university he worked for. He was deliberately provocative. When colleagues visited his apartment, they found him living in near poverty despite having a salary, eating out of cans, sleeping on a cot, furniture covered in dust. He was making a point about how ridiculous bourgeois domesticity was. But mostly, he just seemed weird. He wore rumpled clothes. He rarely bathed. He was sarcastic and contemptuous toward wealthy people and academic establishment figures. In other words, Veblen was everything a prestigious economist wasn't supposed to be. He was poor, strange, unmarried, then divorced, then remarried, then divorced again, and openly hostile to the very people who controlled academia. But in 1899, this odd, unemployable man published a book that would become one of the most influential works in economics and sociology, The Theory of the Leisure Class. And in that book, Veblen explained something that no economist had ever properly articulated: that people don't just buy things for their usefulness. They buy things to show off. And that insight changed everything. Let me explain Veblen's central insight, because it's brilliant and completely counterintuitive to classical economics. Classical economists like Adam Smith believed people were rational. You buy bread because you need to eat. You buy a coat because you need warmth. Utility, usefulness, determines what you buy. Veblen said, that's nonsense. And here's the proof. Look at the wealthy. They don't buy things because they're useful. They buy things because they're expensive. The entire point is to demonstrate that they can afford to waste money. Veblen called this conspicuous consumption. Consumption that's designed to be seen, to be conspicuous, to signal status. Let me give you his examples from the 1890s. Example 1. Fancy silverware in China. Wealthy households in the Gilded Age own elaborate silver utensils and fine china. Was this because silver forks made food taste better? No, it was to show guests, look how much money we can waste on eating implements. Example 2. Lawns. Veblen noticed that wealthy people maintain massive, perfectly manicured lawns. Lawns produce nothing. You can't eat them. They require constant expensive maintenance. Gardeners water, time. That's exactly the point. A lawn signals, I have so much land and money that I can afford to dedicate acres of it to completely useless grass. Its waste is a status symbol. Example 3. corsets and impractical women's fashion. Veblen observed that upper-class women wore corsets that made breathing difficult and dresses so elaborate they couldn't do any physical labor. This wasn't about beauty. It was about signaling. This woman doesn't need to work. Her husband is so wealthy she can be completely non-functional. She's an ornament. Veblen's insight was devastating. The wealthy aren't consuming for utility. They're consuming for social positioning. And the less useful something is, the better it signals wealth. But here's where Veblen went further than just describing rich people. He identified a second pattern that explained middle-class behavior. Veblen noticed that middle-class people imitate upper-class consumption patterns, even when they can't afford it. They buy smaller versions of the same status goods. They go into debt to signal status. A middle-class family in 1890 couldn't afford a mansion, but they could buy fancy furniture. They couldn't afford a full staff of servants, but they could hire one maid and make sure everyone knew about it. Why? Because in a capitalist society, your social position is determined by your consumption. People judge you by what you own, what you wear, where you live. So everyone is trapped in a race to outconsume each other. The wealthy consume to differentiate themselves from the middle class. The middle class consumes to differentiate themselves from the working class. Everyone is performing status through spending. Veblen called this invidious comparison, keeping up with and trying to surpass your neighbors and peers. And here's what Veblen realized that was truly radical. This system is waste. Enormous, society-wide waste. Resources that could go to productive investment or improving people's lives instead go to useless status signaling. But wait, you might be thinking, okay, that was true in 1899. Surely we're more rational now? Let me show you why Veblen's ideas are more relevant today than ever. Here's what makes Veblen's work so prescient. He predicted exactly how consumer capitalism would evolve. And we're living in the world he described. Let's go through modern examples of conspicuous consumption and see how perfectly they match Veblen's 1899 analysis. Example 1, luxury fashion. A Louis Vuitton handbag costs maybe $100 to $200 to manufacture. It sells for $2,000 to $3,000. You're not paying for quality. Studies show mid-range bags are often more durable. You're paying for the logo. Why? Because everyone recognizes that logo. It signals, I can afford to spend $3,000 on a bag. That's pure Veblenian conspicuous consumption. The entire value is in being seen with it. Gucci, Prada, Hermes, these brands exist to signal status. The $300,000 Hermes Birkin bag, it's the modern equivalent of Veblen's silver utensils. Completely impractical, deliberately expensive, purely about signaling. Example 2, luxury cars. A Toyota Camry will get you from point A to point B reliably and efficiently. A Ferrari costs 10 times more, is less reliable, less practical, and more expensive to maintain. Why do people buy Ferraris? Veblen would say, because they're expensive and impractical. That's the point. Driving a Ferrari signals, I'm so wealthy that I can afford a completely impractical vehicle. The entire luxury car market, Lamborghini, Rolls-Royce, Bentley, exists for conspicuous consumption. The car is secondary. The signal is primary. Example 3, Instagram and social media. This is where Veblen predictions become almost spooky. Social media has turned conspicuous consumption into the organizing principle of daily life. Instagram is literally a platform for conspicuous consumption. People don't just buy luxury goods. They photograph themselves with luxury goods to broadcast status to followers. Influencers don't go to expensive restaurants because they love food. They go so they can post pictures showing they can afford expensive restaurants. The consumption isn't even the point anymore. The documentation of consumption is the point. Veblen would have loved Instagram. It's conspicuous consumption perfected. Consumption that exists only to be seen. Example 4, experience economy. Millennials and Gen Z supposedly value experiences over things. They'd rather travel than buy a house. Sounds less materialistic, right? Veblen would disagree. Expensive travel is conspicuous consumption. You go to Bali or Santorini and post photos on Instagram. You're signaling, I can afford international travel and time off work. The experience itself might be enjoyable, but the social signaling is the primary motivation. Music festivals, exclusive restaurants, adventure tourism. It's all conspicuous consumption rebranded for a generation that pretends to care less about material goods while actually being more obsessed with status signaling than ever. Example 5. The debt-fueled lifestyle. Here's where Veblen's pecuniary emulation becomes tragic. Middle-class Americans go into massive debt to signal status they don't have. Credit card debt in the U.S. is over $1 trillion. Much of it is from people buying status goods they can't afford, designer clothes, new cars, expensive vacations. They're performing well for social media and social circles while actually being broke. This is Veblen's pecuniary emulation on steroids. People bankrupting themselves to keep up with consumption patterns they see online. Veblen saw this in 1899, middle-class families stretching to buy fancy furniture. Today, it's middle-class people financing BMWs at 7% interest to maintain an image. The mechanism is identical. The scale is much larger. Now, here's where Veblen's insight becomes even more interesting. He identified something that contradicts the basic laws of economics. In normal markets, when prices go up, demand goes down. Bread costs more, people buy less bread. Simple. But Veblen noticed that for status goods, the opposite happens. When prices go up, demand goes up, because the entire point is that it's expensive. Economists now call these Veblen goods. Products where demand increases as price increases, because the high price is the product's main feature. Let me give you examples. Champagne. Dom Perignon costs hundreds of dollars per bottle. If Dom Perignon suddenly cost $20, people would stop buying it. Why? Because the entire appeal is that it's expensive. It's a status signal. At $20, it signals nothing. Designer fashion. When Hermes raises the price of a Birkin bag from $10,000 to $30,000, the waiting list gets longer. The higher price makes it more desirable because it's a more exclusive status signal. Premium vodka. Blind taste tests show people can't distinguish expensive vodka from cheap vodka. But Grey Goose outsells cheaper vodkas because it's expensive. Clubs charge $400 for bottles that cost $30 wholesale. Why? Status signaling. Here's the truly strange part. Veblen goods violate the rational actor assumption that underlies all of mainstream economics. People aren't maximizing utility. They're maximizing status signaling. This is why luxury brands never discount their products. Discounting would destroy the entire value proposition. The value isn't the bag or the watch. It's the price tag. Veblen understood this in 1899. It took mainstream economics another 80 years to acknowledge he was right. Now, Veblen wasn't just describing conspicuous consumption. He was attacking it, and his critique was savage. Veblen argued that conspicuous consumption represents enormous waste. Resources that could build schools, hospitals, infrastructure, or improve living standards instead go to useless status signaling. He called the wealthy, the leisure class, not as a compliment but as an indictment. They're economically useless. They don't produce anything. They just consume conspicuously to maintain social position. Veblen contrasted them with what he called the industrial class, the engineers, workers, and producers who actually make things. These people create value. The leisure class just displays it. But here's Veblen's most radical argument. Conspicuous consumption doesn't just waste resources, it corrupts the entire economy. Because if status comes from consumption, then everyone, including the middle class, is trapped in an arms race of spending. You need to outconsume your peers to maintain social position. This creates problem 1, perpetual dissatisfaction. No amount of consumption is ever enough, because there's always someone consuming more. The goalposts constantly move. You're on a treadmill you can never get off. Problem 2, debt and financial instability. When people go into debt to signal status, the entire economy becomes fragile. The 2008 financial crisis was partly driven by people buying houses they couldn't afford to signal status. That's Veblen's pecuniary emulation causing economic collapse. Problem 3, environmental destruction. Conspicuous consumption requires endless production of useless goods. Luxury fashion, disposable trends, planned obsolescence, all driven by the need to constantly signal status through new consumption. This is ecologically unsustainable. Veblen was writing in 1899, but he saw where this was heading. A society organized around wasteful status competition that makes everyone miserable and eventually destroys itself. And here's the darkest part of Veblen's analysis. There's no easy way out. Because in a capitalist society, your social worth is determined by your consumption. You can opt out as an individual. Veblen himself did, living in poverty despite his salary. But opting out means social exile. You're judged as a failure if you're not consuming at your income level. The system perpetuates itself through social pressure. So what happened to Veblen? He died in 1929, largely forgotten and impoverished. He'd been fired from his last academic position. His books sold poorly during his lifetime. He died alone in a cabin in California, but his ideas didn't die. In the 1950s and 60s, sociologists rediscovered Veblen. His concept of conspicuous consumption became central to understanding modern consumer capitalism. Today, Veblen's insights are everywhere. In marketing, luxury brands explicitly use Veblenian logic. In sociology, status anxiety studies. In behavioral economics, irrational consumption patterns. And his ideas are more relevant now than ever, because social media has turned everyone into conspicuous consumers. We're all performing status constantly, through what we buy, where we travel, what we eat, what we photograph. The Instagram economy is Veblen's theory perfected. Every post is conspicuous consumption. Every like is social validation of your status performance. Veblen would say, you're all trapped in a system that makes you miserable while enriching luxury brands and creating ecological disaster. And you can't escape because your social worth depends on continuing to play the game. That's a pretty dark diagnosis. But here's the thing, Veblen was probably right. Thorstein Veblen was a strange, difficult, and a social person who couldn't hold a job and died alone. But he understood something fundamental about human behavior that most economists missed. We don't buy things because they're useful. We buy things to signal who we are, or who we want people to think we are. That insight, conspicuous consumption, explains luxury brands, social media culture, lifestyle influencers, and why people go into debt to buy things they don't need. Veblen saw it all in 1899. He predicted the Instagram economy before the internet existed. He explained why people buy $10,000 handbags and $400 bottles of vodka. He diagnosed the disease that drives modern consumer capitalism. And the really uncomfortable question is, if Veblen was right, and we're all trapped in a wasteful, unsatisfying status competition, what do we do about it? If this changed how you think about why you buy what you buy, hit subscribe. Drop a comment. What's the most Veblenian thing you've ever bought? And share this with someone who needs to understand that luxury isn't about quality. It's about signaling. Because the first step to escaping the trap is recognizing you're in one. I'll see you in the next one.